topic for tonight is the decline of the US. I'm Arthur Chesterfield-Evans. I'll be chairing, and I'm very pleased to announce that we've been lucky enough to get Richard Branowski to be our speaker. Richard is a retired diplomat, and it's...
A not very diplomatic one.
Not true.
Extremely diplomatic.
Not I wanted to, of course, introduce Richard, and Kathy had asked him for a CV and been given a fairly meagre offering, I thought. So I thought, I'll ring him and ask for a bit more. So I got another meagre offering as well. So I have two meagre offerings put together to offer you. So all I can say is that once you're a diplomat and you've been hiding your light under a bushel for, 50 years or so, you probably just can't blow your own trumpet. But if you think, as I do, that understatement is really rather a nice thing to be shocked by, then perhaps we'll have some. So Richard is well, perhaps I should say something about before I introduce Richard. I should say a little bit about the decline of the US, because they dominate the world to such an extent that it's what they're doing next that tends to determine things. So if you say, well, are they declining, and if so, why, and what effect would it have, you have to justify that position to some extent. And one has to look at the decline as being a relative decline. The US had immense advantages in World War II when they didn't have a war that directly involved them, and they could supply everybody else, which was immensely powerful for their industries, which of course had Henry Ford and automation and things taking them to the advantage. And of course they'd managed to get a lot of assets out of the First World War, and then along came the Second World War. So at the end of the Second World War, they had 34% of world GDP, which I don't think anyone else has ever had ever. It's now dropped to 17%, so in relative terms, in terms of GDP, if you think that means anything, they're half as powerful as they were at the end of the Second World War, which I think is actually quite significant. If you look at it comparatively, in 2009, the US, Europe and Asia each had 26% of world GDP, and the rest of the world had 23%. Now Asia has moved ahead, of course, largely on the back of China. Now, the US has always had very high military spending. In fact, you could argue that it didn't really demobilise to the extent other countries did, except for Russia, of course, which went broke from its military spending. At the end of the Second World War, the US didn't stop high military spending. And of course, the relationship between the military and industries and the government system was far closer than in other countries. And Eisenhower, of course, is famous for warning about the danger of the military-industrial complex. And my own view is that we are seeing the end point of that, and what Eisenhower warned against has happened. But if you look at what's actually happening in the US, the concentration of capital at the top end has meant that the US has the fourth highest poverty rate in the OECD at 17.8%. Poverty rate being the ratio of the number of people whose income falls below the poverty line, which is taken as half the median household income of the total population. In other words, how many are concentrated at the bottom. It has the lowest spending on social programs as a percentage of GDP of the OECD. It has the lowest paid holidays, the lowest maternity leave, and it had the lowest social mobility until last year, when actually the UK beat them as having the lowest social mobility. So in terms of a land of opportunity where anybody can get from the bottom to the top, in fact they can't. If you're going to have social mobility, you have to educate the people at the bottom to give them some sort of hope at a statistical level to climb up. If you don't educate them at the bottom, then of course they've got very little chance. I mean, anything is possible. The question is, how likely is something? If you're looking at populations, you've got to look at not what happens to the exception that you can say, what about that person? So what happens to Joe and Susan average? What chance have they got? And if you're in the US, you've got the second worst chance in the OECD. They have the highest infant mortality rate. They have the highest obesity rate in the world, although I think probably American Samoa has been overlooked, but that's not sort of a very significant number country. They have the highest prevalence of mental illness despite the highest use of antidepressants. They have the highest homicide rate, and they have the largest prison population. And they have the third shortest life expectancy in the OECD. And a study I did some years ago looking at the relationship between health and income across the world was that up to $5,000 of US of income per year, the more money a country had, the better its infant mortality rate. After $5,000 US, it was how equally the money was spread. In other words, you can spend a fortune on your rich people and your intensive care units, but if you don't do the most basic things for your poor people, you'll never get your health rate up in terms of indices that matter. And the two indices that matter in health are the infant mortality rate and the life expectancy, because they're easy to measure. So that's what you use if you're looking at it from a public health point of view. And the US isn't doing well on either of those indices. They have the highest high school dropout rate in the OECD and the largest prison population. They have almost as much military spending as the rest of the world put together, which has the significance, if you look at it historically. The Roman Empire basically imploded. They had paid mercenaries, because they ran out of soldiers, to look up the frontiers of their empire. And of course they were paid for by Roman taxpayers. When the Roman taxpayers couldn't pay the mercenaries said, we're not going to fight for you, we'll fight for the people we come from, which happen to be around here anyway. So the empire simply imploded, basically because they couldn't pay for their military. If you look at what happened to the Russians, the Soviet Union, and now we look at the Americans and wonder how much longer can the national debt keep rising. And of course, the other thing that supports America very much is the currency. And there's what they call signorage, I think that pronunciation is correct, where if you have the currency, if the US dollar is effectively the world currency, the only people who can simply print them is the Americans. So they can print money. If Zimbabwe prints money, everybody says, no, your dollar's no good, mate. It's not worth the paper it's written on. We won't cash it in. If the Americans print dollars, they're kind of giving money to the world, and the world can all use it. So they get away with it much longer, and I think they have. But it is said that some of the wars, I don't know if Richard could comment on this, some of the wars, particularly in Iraq and in the attack on Libya, were because they decided not to use US dollars to pay. And of course, if significant numbers of people didn't use US dollars, that threatens the US dollar as the world currency. And that threatens the advantage that the US has by being the world currency. And if that process goes more, and I think Iran also is threatening them to use other currencies, this is a great threat to the US. And of course, the effect of the Saudis staying in US is very important. And I have heard from some of my people who trade currencies that China is amassing gold so that we go back to a gold standard when there's a finite amount of money related to the amount of gold, and other money would just be paper. If that were to happen, of course, the US, which has been losing its gold for a long time, would again be undermined at a currency level. So these are things that are certainly threats. Now, how great those threats are depends, I think, a bit who you talk to. A survey showed that 94% of US millionaires are scared of riots in the streets, which, if you assume this couldn't possibly happen because they've got, rubber bullets and special truncheons and water cannons and so on, the kind of overreaction to the Occupy movement, which only had 50,000 people in New York, which is said to be a fairly small demonstration for New York, but there was very high reaction to that. So in a sense, like things that implode, it always looks very solid until the day it falls. And I think one has to ask, to what extent is the system, which is unfair and becoming more so, how secure is it to a real threat when people get annoyed? If you just looked at something recently here, they decided they'd put a few horse races on the Opera House, and hey presto, within 48 hours there were 215,000 signatures and a demonstration of the Opera House and a torch shown in the Opera House, so that, just a torch, a searchlight shown in the Opera House, organised to make sure you couldn't see the horse racing numbers. Now, that's not a bad effort. People were very angry, and this anger comes quite quickly. Now, if you look at inequality in the US, you can have this thing called the Gini index, which is the index of the difference between the rich and the poor. The US is fourth after Mexico. The ones ahead of it are Mexico, Turkey, Chile, and then the US within the OECD. So the US's level of inequality is bad and rising. Australia's not doing very well either, I might say, and it's rising as well, but we're still at the moment behind the US. 400 people in the US have more money than 155 million, and that also is rising in terms of in favour of the 400. Bill Gates, of course, the richest man, is worth $66 billion. But at a philosophic level, James Clapper was on 7:30 Report just last night. He is the ex-head of US intelligence. And he was concerned that the US leads the way in undermining what he called the knowledge professions, the science profession, the academics, and his own profession, which is the intelligence community. And he said these communities, what they have in common is that they're interested in what the truth is, the actual facts, the actual reality, not some sort of fake news or some sort of constructed thing that happens. And it struck me when Trump got in and someone said, well, what's he going to do? And I said, well, think of what a dodgy real estate agent would do in that situation. See if that's the model you could do. And it's true that you don't always know what a dodgy real estate agent would do, but it might be an approximation that you could use. So I thought, well, if you're in real estate and you say this is worth $1 million when it's worth $500,000, if the person you're talking to believes you and pays you $1 million, your truth won, didn't it? And I thought, well, I wonder if that's the model for truth now. I say, if you believe, then hey, we're all happy, aren't we? So how much can reality actually, at what point is reality defined, and what point does reality exist? And of course the scientists would say, well, whatever we say, the law of gravity is, the law of physics is, and the truth is. And I think there's a battle in this, but I feel that the US has gone too far. And the point James Clapper made on the 7:30 Report, even last night, was that there's a lack of faith in the US. People suspect it has no real strategy. It's being run impulsively by Trump. It's being run opportunistically. And it doesn't have a goal or a vision. And this means their credibility does not exist. And in a sense, that's very important if you're the premier world power. So I don't have an answer to this question, and I'm not trying to be a doomsayer or whatever, but I do think There are economic indicators and there are philosophic indicators that do suggest there's a severe problem. And the question is how that will play out. And we'd be interested later on, of course, to have your feedback about how it is. But to get back to where I started, we have the privilege this evening of having Richard Branowski with us, which is a considerable thing. As I said, the chap does suffer from an excess of modesty. But I'll just quickly run through the miserable CV that I've managed to extract. He was educated at Adelaide University and then at Harvard School of Public Administration at John F. Kennedy School. He was a diplomat by profession, an Australian ambassador to Vietnam, Republic of Korea, Mexico, Central American republics and Cuba after having postings in Tokyo, Rangoon, Tehran and Manila. So he's got around a fair bit. He was General Manager of Radio Australia and he was Adjunct Professor in Media Studies at the University of Sydney from 2003 to 2013. He is the immediate past President of the New South Wales branch of the Australian Institute of International Affairs, which is probably our best institution in terms of that particular area of study. He's a writer and public commentator on foreign affairs, and he admits to 4 books, I don't know how many he's really written. A Witness to History in 2001, Fact or Fiction, The Truth About Australia's Nuclear Ambition from 2003, a diplomatic autobiography called Driven from HarperCollins in 2009, and The Fallout from Fukushima in 2012. So I've introduced to you for his insights, and very proud to introduce Richard Branowski. Thanks, Richard.